The gavel cracked like a gunshot, and a hush fell over the room. Pearl Connolly felt her world shrink to the size of that wooden auction block. Her knuckles were bone white where she gripped her shawl. Across the room, the banker, Otto Blackwell, gave a thin, satisfied smile. He looked like a wolf who'd already tasted blood. This was it. The auction for her family's cabin, the only home she'd ever known. It was 1873 in Whispering Pines, Colorado, and the silver had run dry. For most folks, that meant empty pockets and hollow bellies. For a man like Blackwell, it meant a feast. Pearl's father had been gone 6 months, leaving her the cabin and the land it sat on, a perfect patch of earth overlooking the valley. But he'd left her something else, too. A secret he'd carried to his grave. Blackwell had shown up the day after the funeral, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. He told her about the loan. $300 her father had borrowed for her mother's medicine years ago. $300 that had swelled with interest, growing into a monster she couldn't possibly fight. She was 22 years old, and she'd tried. She took in laundry until her hands were raw. She sold her mother's silver hairbrush, the last pretty thing she owned. She even served drinks at the saloon, enduring the leers and whispers. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Now, here she was. Her entire world was on the block, ready to be sold. And Blackwell was here to buy it. He knew something the others didn't. He knew about the water. A spring on her land that never ran dry, making it the most valuable piece of property in the county. He was going to steal it for pennies. "We'll start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer chirped, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Pearl's heart hit the floor. $50. Blackwell's hand shot up. $50 from Mr. Blackwell, the auctioneer called out, a little too eagerly. Pearl squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't watch. In her pocket she had $47.16, every last cent she had in this world. It was useless. Her home was gone. Then a voice cut through the silence, deep, calm, and clear. $100. Pearl's eyes flew open. The crowd shifted, murmuring, parting like a river around a stone. At the back of the room stood a man. He was tall, his hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. All she could see was a strong jaw, dark stubble, and eyes that looked like a gathering storm. The whole room turned to stare. Blackwell's face, which had been so smug just a moment before, twisted into a dark scowl. He stared at the stranger, sizing him up. $100 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer announced, his voice cracking with surprise. Who was this man? Blackwell wasn't about to be shown up. 120, he snapped, his voice tight with anger. The stranger didn't even hesitate. 200. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was more than talk. This was real money. Pearl stared, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Why would a complete stranger bid on her cabin? And where did he get that kind of coin? 250, Blackwell bid out, his face beginning to flush. The stranger took a step forward, out of the shadows. Now she could see him. He wasn't a fancy man. He wore a faded blue shirt, a worn leather vest, and dusty boots. A simple cowboy. But there was nothing simple about the way he held himself. 300, he said, his voice steady as a rock. This was the full amount of the supposed debt. It was a fortune in this town. Blackwell was practically shaking with rage now. He was a man used to getting his way, a man who crushed anyone who stood against him. He wouldn't be beaten. 350, he spat, the words tasting like poison. The stranger took another step. His spurs jingled, a soft, metallic sound in the tense silence. He looked directly at Blackwell, and for the first time, a small, cold smile touched his lips. $500. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Blackwell's face had gone from red to a terrifying shade of purple. $500 was more than most men in Whispering Pines saw in a year. It was an impossible sum for a piece of land with a simple cabin on it. "Do I hear 550?" the auctioneer squeaked, looking nervously at the banker. Blackwell just stood there, his jaw working, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was frightening. He looked from the stranger to Pearl, and then back again. Finally, with a curt shake of his head, he conceded. "This is absurd," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The property isn't worth half that." He had lost. "Going once at $500, the auctioneer called, his voice regaining its confidence. "Going twice, sold, to the gentleman for $500. The gavel came down, and the sound sealed her fate. But what fate was it? Her cabin was safe from Blackwell, but it was sold all the same. Sold to a man she'd never seen before, a man who had just spent a fortune on her home for reasons she couldn't possibly imagine. Pearl felt a wave of dizziness, a confusing mix of relief and pure terror. Her nightmare with Blackwell was over, but a new, unknown story had just begun. As the crowd started to break up, buzzing with gossip, Pearl moved through them like she was in a dream. She had to know. She had to understand. The mysterious cowboy was at the front now, signing papers with the auctioneer, handing over a thick stack of cash. As she got closer, he turned, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He had a rugged, handsome face, with faint lines around his eyes that said he wasn't a stranger to smiling. But he wasn't smiling now. His expression was serious, intense, as his stormy eyes met hers. "Miss Connolly?" he asked. His voice was even deeper up close. "Yes," she managed, lifting her chin, refusing to look like a damsel in distress, even though her world had just been turned completely upside down. "Owen Xavier," he said, extending a hand. She hesitated for a beat before taking it. His grip was strong, firm, but not crushing. "Mr. Xavier," she said, pulling her hand back. "I'm grateful, truly. But I have to ask, why? Why did you just spend $500 on my cabin?" Owen's eyes flickered past her, landing on Otto Blackwell, who was watching them from across the room with undisguised venom. "Perhaps," Owen suggested quietly, "we could discuss this somewhere more private. Your cabin, for instance." Pearl's back went rigid. "Mr. Xavier, I don't know you from Adam. I'm not about to invite a strange man into my home." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough. The cafe across the street, then. Public enough for propriety." She needed answers. She owed him that much. "Very well," she agreed. The cafe was quiet. They took a small table by the window. After they ordered coffee, Pearl folded her hands on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm waiting, Mr. Xavier." He took off his hat, setting it on the table. He had thick, dark hair with a slight curl. "I came to town a few days ago," he began. "Looking for land, something with good water." Pearl's guard went right back up. "So, you know about the spring?" He nodded. "I do my homework. Your land has one of the best water sources in the region, but that's not the only reason I was at the auction today." "Then what is?" she pressed. His gaze hardened. "I was in the saloon yesterday. I overheard Blackwell talking with his men, bragging about how he was going to take your land for nothing, then turn around and sell the water rights to the mining company for a king's ransom. He said you were just a naive girl who didn't know what she had." Owen's eyes were cold now. "I don't take kindly to men who prey on the vulnerable." "So that was it? An act of charity, a rich man's good deed." She wasn't sure how to feel about that. "So you saved me out of the goodness of your heart?" she asked, a skeptical edge to her voice. Not exactly, he said. The small smile returned. I still want the land, but I believe in paying a fair price, not stealing it. The land isn't mine to sell anymore, she pointed out, the bitter truth of it hitting her again. You bought it. I bought the deed, he corrected. But I have a proposition for you. She raised an eyebrow. I plan to start a cattle operation, he explained. I need someone who knows this land, the seasons, the weather, the soil. I'll hire you. You can keep living in your cabin. I'll pay you a fair wage for your expertise. Pearl stared at him, trying to find the catch. It sounded too good to be true. Men didn't just ride into town and solve all your problems. Life wasn't a fairy tale. Why would you do that? Because it's good business, he said simply, and because I have no interest in making a woman homeless. He saw the suspicion in her eyes and added, My intentions are purely professional, Miss Connolly. I need your knowledge of this land. Nothing more. She didn't believe him. Not completely. But what choice did she have? The cabin wasn't hers. She was at his mercy. This arrangement, strange as it was the only thing that kept a roof over her head. I'll think about your offer, she said finally. Of course. He stood, putting his hat back on. I'm at the boarding house on Main Street. Let me know your decision. He left a few coins for the coffee, tipped his hat, and walked out. Pearl watched him go, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Otto Blackwell had been defeated, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just traded one powerful man for another, and she had no idea if her new landlord would be a savior or a different kind of devil. The next morning, Pearl woke with the sun, the cold reality of her situation crashing down on her. The cabin, the land, her entire life, now belonged to a stranger named Owen Xavier. She sat on her porch, sipping coffee, watching the mountains turn from gray to gold. This land was in her blood, and the thought of leaving it was a physical pain. Then she saw him, a rider coming from town. Even from a distance, she recognized his broad shoulders and the confident way he sat his horse. Owen Xavier. Good morning, Miss Connolly, he called out as he rode up, tipping his hat. Hope I'm not too early. We rise with the sun out here, Mr. Xavier, she said, standing, instinctively smoothing her apron. He swung down from his horse, a handsome chestnut stallion. I was hoping you'd show me the property today. That is, if you've decided to accept my offer. She hadn't decided. Not really. But what was the harm in showing him the land? It might tell her more about his true intentions. I can spare some time, she said. Would you like some coffee? His face lit up with a genuine smile. I'd like that very much. Inside the cabin, he stood near the door, hat in hand, looking around. The space was small, but she kept it clean and tidy. Her father's craftsmanship was in every joint of the log walls, every stone of the fireplace. My father built this place, she said, her voice soft. Built it for my mother. It's a fine home, Owen said, his voice sincere. Solid work. She handed him a cup of coffee, and for a moment they stood in an awkward silence. Then Pearl put her cup down. We should go. The sun's getting high. She no longer had a horse of her own. She'd sold it months ago. Without a word, Owen offered his hand. She hesitated, then let him help her up onto his stallion before he mounted behind her. His closeness was unsettling. His chest was a solid wall at her back, his arms around her to hold the reins. He smelled of leather and soap, a clean scent that was nothing like the stale whiskey and cigar smoke that clung to most men in town. It was distracting. They rode the boundaries of the 80-acre property. She showed him the best places for grazing, the lowlands that turned to mud in the spring, the rocky cliffs where eagles nested. He listened to everything, asking smart questions that showed he knew his business. He wasn't just playing at being a rancher. They stopped by the stream, the one Blackwell coveted. "It never runs dry," she told him as they dismounted. "My father always said a person could survive anything with good water." Owen knelt, trailing his fingers in the icy, clear current. He was a wise man. He was, Pearl agreed, a familiar ache in her heart. "I still don't understand why he never told me about the loan." Owen stood, wiping his hand on his jeans. "Maybe he was trying to protect you from the worry. Pride can make a man do foolish things." His words were gentle, but they held a weight, as if he knew something about foolish pride himself. As they rode back, she found herself asking, "You know a lot about cattle. Where are you from?" "Texas," he said. "Grew up on a ranch, worked cattle my whole life." "Why come all the way to Colorado?" she asked. "Texas has plenty of land." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I needed a fresh start," he said finally. His voice was low, guarded. "Some places hold too many memories." She didn't push. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past. Back at the cabin, he helped her down. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, and for a second, they stood there, closer than they needed to be. The air between them crackled. Pearl stepped back, her heart beating a little too fast. "Thank you for the tour," Owen said, his voice even. "This land is everything I hoped for." He looked at her expectantly. "About my proposition." She took a deep breath. "I'll accept your offer, Mr. Xavier. I'll stay and help you. But I want the terms in writing, clear and fair." A real smile broke across his face, transforming him. It reached his eyes, chasing away the shadows. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Connolly." As he turned to leave, she called out to him, "Mr. Xavier." He stopped, turning in the saddle. "Thank you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "For what you did. For stopping Blackwell." He tipped his hat. "Some men need stopping." With that, he rode away, leaving Pearl standing in the dust, the strange feeling washing over her that her life hadn't just been saved, it had been bought, and the price was still unknown. Life settled into a strange new pattern. Owen was true to his word. A lawyer from the next town over drew up a contract. It was fair, just as he'd promised. It named her a consultant, gave her a good wage, and guaranteed her right to live in the cabin. He even added a clause she never would have thought to ask for. If he ever sold the land, she had the first right to buy it back. Owen was a whirlwind of activity. A herd of cattle arrived, along with 2 seasoned ranch hands. Construction began on a new ranch house, a barn and corrals, all a respectable distance from her cabin. He worked from sunup to sundown, and he expected the same from his men. But he was fair, and he worked harder than any of them. He consulted her on everything. He listened when she told him which meadows flooded and where the earliest grass grew. He was respectful, almost formal. But sometimes she'd catch him watching her, a strange, unreadable expression in his eyes. It made her skin prickle. About a month after the auction, she was walking back from town when she heard shouting. It was coming from the construction site. She hurried, her heart pounding. As she cleared the trees, she saw Owen, standing face to face with Otto Blackwell. Blackwell's face was a blotchy red. "The deal is off, Xavier," he was yelling. "The mining company doubled their offer." "There was never a deal, Blackwell," Owen said, his voice dangerously calm. "I bought this land. It's not for sale." "You don't know who you're dealing with," Blackwell threatened, stepping closer. "I run this town. I can make your life a living hell." "Is that a fact?" Owen's hand drifted down, resting near the revolver on his hip. He didn't draw it, but the message was clear. Blackwell took a half step back, his bravado faltering. This isn't over. Then he saw Pearl. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. You should have been smarter, girl. Now you'll end up with nothing. I think you should leave, Mr. Blackwell, Pearl said, her voice shaking slightly as she walked to stand beside Owen. You're trespassing, Blackwell sneered, but he turned and stalked back to his horse. You two fools deserve each other, he shouted over his shoulder before riding off in a cloud of dust. What was that about? Pearl asked, turning to Owen. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. He's not giving up. The mining company wants to divert our stream. They need the water for a new silver vein they've struck. A cold dread washed over her. Can they do that? Legally? Not legally, Owen said, his eyes hard. But a man like Blackwell doesn't always care about the law. What are we going to do? She asked, and she didn't miss the fact that she'd said, we. Owen looked down at her, and for a moment, the professional distance between them vanished. We, he said, a small, determined smile on his face, are going to stand our ground. But as the days turned into weeks, Pearl began to realize something was wrong. It wasn't just Blackwell. It was Owen. He was a good rancher, no doubt about it. But there were other things. Small things that didn't add up. The way he moved, silent and watchful. The way his eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, as if he were expecting trouble. And he was a dead shot with that revolver. She'd seen him shoot a rattlesnake from 50 yards without even seeming to aim. That wasn't the kind of skill a simple Texas cowboy just picked up. One evening, he was helping her fix a broken latch on her cabin door. Their hands brushed, and a jolt went through her. She pulled back quickly. Sorry, he mumbled, not looking at her. It's fine, she said, her voice a little breathless. Later that night, unable to sleep, she decided to organize her father's old things, stored in a dusty trunk at the foot of her bed. She pulled out his worn work clothes, his tools, a few faded photographs. At the very bottom, tucked beneath a false panel she never knew existed, was a small leather-bound journal. Her heart skipped a beat. She'd never seen it before. Her father wasn't a man for writing. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with his familiar blocky script. It wasn't a daily diary. It was more like a ledger, filled with notes about the cabin, the weather, the land. She flipped through the pages, a lump forming in her throat. It felt like hearing his voice again. Near the end, the entries became shorter, more frantic. One stood out. The burden is too great. Blackwell knows. He will not stop. I had to protect her. God forgive me. What burden? What did Blackwell know? She kept reading, her hands trembling. A few pages later, another entry, this one almost illegible. The deal was a devil's bargain. I should have told the truth from the start. Now the debt is not just in gold, but in blood. I fear for what will happen when I am gone. The land holds the key. The land remembers. Debt in blood. She thought back to the story about her mother's medicine. Had that been a lie? What was her father hiding? She flipped to the very last page. There was only one thing written there. A name. Xavier. A cold, paralyzing dread crept up her spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. The name of the man who now owned her land, written in her father's secret journal. Owen hadn't just stumbled into Whispering Pines by accident. He hadn't bought her land on a whim. He had come here for a reason. He was connected to her father's secret, to the debt in blood. The man living just a quarter-mile away, the man whose touch made her heart race, was not who he said he was. He was a lie. And she was trapped on her own land with him, completely and utterly alone. The next day was a nightmare. Pearl moved through her chores in a fog, the journal hidden beneath her mattress like a coiled snake. Every time she saw Owen, her stomach twisted into a knot. Every polite word, every casual smile from him felt like a betrayal. He was playing a part, and she was his unwilling audience. She had to know the truth. But how could she confront him? He was stronger, he was armed, and he held the deed to her life. That evening, he came to her cabin, just as the sun was setting. "Pearl," he said, his voice gentle, "there's a storm coming in. We should check on the cattle in the north pasture." Her mind raced. The north pasture was the most isolated part of the property. If he meant her harm, that would be the place to do it. But staying here, waiting in fear, was worse. She needed answers. "All right," she said, her voice tight. She grabbed her heavy shawl and, on a sudden impulse, slipped her father's old skinning knife into her pocket. The weight of it was a small, cold comfort. They rode together on his horse, the sky turning a bruised purple ahead of them. The wind was picking up, whipping her hair across her face. The air was thick with tension, and it wasn't just the coming storm. "You've been quiet today," Owen said, his voice close to her ear. "Just tired," she lied. They reached the north pasture and found the cattle huddled together, restless. As they worked to move the herd toward a more sheltered canyon, a flash of lightning lit up the landscape. In that brief, stark light, Pearl saw it. 3 riders watching them from a ridge not far away. "Owen," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. He'd seen them too. In one smooth motion, he drew his revolver. "Get behind me," he ordered. The riders spurred their horses, charging down the ridge toward them. They weren't ranch hands. They were rough men, with the hard, cruel faces of hired thugs. Blackwell's men. "Xavier," one of them shouted. "The boss wants his property back." They were fanned out, trying to circle them. Owen didn't panic. He was eerily calm. He raised his pistol, aimed, and fired. The shot was deafening. One of the riders cried out and clutched his shoulder, his horse rearing in panic. The other 2 pulled their own guns, and the world exploded into chaos. Gunshots echoed through the valley, mixing with the rumble of thunder. Owen pushed Pearl off the horse, shouting, "Get to the rocks!" She scrambled behind a cluster of boulders as another bullet whizzed past her head, chipping a piece of stone from the rock she was hiding behind. Owen was using his horse for cover, firing back with a speed and accuracy that was terrifying. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a gunman, a skilled one. He shot another man's horse out from under him. The man went down in a heap, and his partner, seeing he was now outmatched, turned and fled. The first man, the one with the wounded shoulder, got to his feet and ran after him into the growing darkness. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the gunfire. The only sounds were the wind, the lowing of the nervous cattle, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Owen came over to her, his gun still in his hand. "Are you all right?" he asked, his face grim in the fading light. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He had just saved her life. But the cold certainty in her gut hadn't changed. He was still a liar. "Let's get you home," he said, his voice rough with adrenaline. Back in the safety of her cabin, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the windows. Owen lit a lantern, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. He holstered his gun and turned to her. "Pearl, about what happened," he began. "Who are you?" she interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. She pulled the journal from under her shawl and threw it on the table between them. "My father wrote your name in his secret journal. The day before he died. Don't you dare lie to me again. Who are you?" Owen stared at the journal, his face pale. The mask of the simple cowboy fell away, replaced by a look of weary resignation. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "My name is not Owen Xavier," he said quietly. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The rain beat against the roof, a relentless drum counting out the seconds of her shattered reality. He wasn't Owen Xavier. The foundation of her new life was a lie. "Who are you, then?" she demanded, her hand instinctively going to the knife in her pocket. He saw the movement, and a flicker of something, disappointment, maybe sadness, crossed his face. "My name is Owen McBride," he said. "And your father." He knew my father. They were partners a long time ago. McBride. The name meant nothing to her. "Partners in what?" "Mining," he said, his voice low. "Before your father was a carpenter, before he built this cabin, he and my father, Angus McBride, were prospecting together. They struck a silver vein up in the mountains. Not a big one, but enough to set both their families up for life." He paced the small cabin, his movements agitated. "They came to Whispering Pines to register the claim. They went to the bank. They went to Otto Blackwell." Pearl's blood ran cold. Blackwell was just starting out then. Owen, or McBride, continued. He saw their discovery not as a loan opportunity, but as a prize to be taken. He tricked them. Used complicated legal papers they couldn't understand to steal the claim right out from under them. He paid them a pittance, a fraction of what it was worth, and took everything. He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes burning with an old fury. "It destroyed my father. He lost everything. The betrayal, the humiliation. It broke him. We lost our home. My mother got sick. We had nothing. He died a few years later, a poor, broken man." "And my father," Pearl whispered. "Your father took his small share and walked away," Owen said, his voice laced with a bitterness that was decades old. "He came down here, bought this land, and tried to forget it ever happened. He left my father to face the ruin alone." It was all starting to make a terrible kind of sense. The secret journal, the debt in blood, her father's guilt. "So you came here for revenge," she said. It wasn't a question. "I came here for justice," he corrected her fiercely. "I came to take back what Blackwell stole from my family. For years I've been tracking his business, learning his weaknesses, waiting for the right moment. I learned he was trying to force you out, and I saw my chance. I was going to use this land, the one thing he desperately wanted, as leverage to ruin him." "You used me," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You saved me from Blackwell just to turn around and use me as a pawn in your own game." "At first, yes," he admitted, and the honesty was more painful than any lie. "That was the plan. But then I met you. I saw your strength, your courage. It wasn't just about the land anymore. Pearl, Stop," she cut him off, holding up a hand. She couldn't hear it. Not now. "So everything, the job, the contract, all of it was just a way to keep me here, to keep me close while you plotted your revenge." He couldn't deny it. The truth was written all over his face, the trust she had started to feel for him, the warmth, the hope. It all curdled into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. He hadn't saved her. He had merely switched out her cage. Suddenly, a loud banging on the door made them both jump. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the heavy, official fist of the law. "Owen McBride!" a voice boomed from outside. "This is Sheriff Jones. We have a warrant for your arrest." Owen's head snapped toward the door, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "How?" he breathed. "The men you shot at," Pearl realized aloud. "They didn't just run away. They ran straight to the sheriff." "Open up, McBride, or we're breaking the door down." Owen looked at Pearl, his eyes pleading. "Pearl, you have to believe me. I never meant to hurt you." But his words were drowned out by the splintering crash of the cabin door being kicked in. Sheriff Jones stood there, flanked by two deputies, their guns drawn and leveled at Owen. Behind them, peering over the sheriff's shoulder with a triumphant smirk, was Otto Blackwell. "It's over, McBride," Blackwell sneered, "or whatever your name is. Attempted murder is a hanging offense in this territory, and your little lady friend here is a witness." The sheriff's eyes landed on Pearl. "Ma'am, did this man attack those fellas out at the north pasture?" This was it. Her moment. She could tell them the truth, that Owen had been defending them, defending their property. Or she could stay silent. She could let this man who had deceived her, who had used her, be taken away. She could let Blackwell win. She looked at Owen, trapped and surrounded. Then she looked at Blackwell, his face alight with victory. She thought of her father's journal, of the guilt he carried. The debt is not just in gold, but in blood. She realized with sickening clarity that Owen wasn't the only one who had been lying. Her entire life had been built on a secret, and now the truth was about to burn it all to the ground. The sheriff's question hung in the air, thick and heavy. All eyes were on her. Owen's, filled with a desperate hope. Blackwell's, glinting with cruel anticipation. She was the key. Her words could either hang Owen McBride or set him free. But what was the truth anymore? This man had lied about his name, his past, his reasons for being here. He had manipulated her. Yet he had also saved her home and protected her life. And Blackwell was a snake, and she knew he was the one who had sent those men. "Well, Miss Connolly," Sheriff Jones prompted, his patience wearing thin. She took a deep breath. "Those men," she said, her voice clear and steady, "were trespassing. They were armed. They shot first." Blackwell's smirk vanished. "She's lying. She's protecting him." "Is that so, Mr. Blackwell?" Pearl shot back, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "What were your employees doing on our land after dark with guns drawn?" The sheriff turned a suspicious eye toward the banker. "Your employees, Otto?" They were checking on a stray herd," Blackwell stammered, caught off guard. "My herd is all accounted for," Owen stated calmly, seeing the opening Pearl had created. "Those men were cutting fences. I have a right to defend my property." Sheriff Jones was a lazy lawman, but he wasn't a complete fool. He knew Blackwell was crooked, but Blackwell paid his salary. He was caught in the middle. "I still have a complaint of attempted murder," he said gruffly. "I'm taking him in. The judge can sort it out." "No!" Pearl cried, but the deputies were already grabbing Owen's arms, disarming him. Owen didn't struggle. He looked at Pearl one last time. "The truth will come out," he said, his voice low and certain. "It always does." They dragged him out into the rain. Blackwell lingered for a moment, his eyes boring into Pearl. "You made a mistake, girl," he hissed. "You chose the wrong side. Now you'll lose everything." He turned and followed the sheriff, leaving Pearl alone in her broken home, the cold rain blowing in through the splintered door. She was alone. Truly alone this time. Owen was in jail. Blackwell was more determined than ever, and she was stuck in the middle, with nothing but a secret journal and the ghost of her father's sins. The next few days were the longest of her life. The town buzzed with rumors. Owen McBride, the mysterious stranger, was a wanted man, a dangerous gunslinger from Texas. The story Blackwell was spinning was that Owen had tried to murder his men in a dispute over land. It was a lie, but it was a believable one. Pearl was a pariah. When she went into town for supplies, people whispered and pointed. She was the woman who was siding with an outlaw against the town's most powerful citizen. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed. She tried to visit Owen in jail, but Sheriff Jones refused. "Judge's orders," he'd said, not meeting her eye. "No visitors." Desperate, she went back to the journal, reading it over and over, searching for a clue, for anything that could help. Her father wrote about the land, about the water. The land holds the key. The land remembers. What did it mean? One night there was a soft tap on her window. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Peeking through the curtains, she saw a young man standing in the shadows. It was Billy, one of Owen's ranch hands. She opened the door a crack. "What is it?" "Miss Connolly," he whispered, twisting his hat in his hands. "Mr. McBride, he ain't safe. I was at the saloon. Heard Blackwell talking to the sheriff. The judge is in Blackwell's pocket. They ain't planning on a trial. They're gonna say they're transporting him to the county seat next week. But they're planning an accident on the road. Blackwell wants him dead." The world tilted on its axis. They were going to murder him. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Mr. McBride, he's a good man. He treated us fair. And my pa was one of the men Blackwell ruined years back. Lost his farm. It ain't right. What's happening?" He pressed something cold and metallic into her hand. A key. "It's a spare for the back door of the jailhouse. Sheriff's a heavy sleeper, especially after a few whiskeys. But you gotta be careful. His deputy, Miller, he's young, but he's watchful." Billy melted back into the night, leaving Pearl with a key and an impossible choice. She could let them kill Owen and be free of all this danger. Or she could risk everything, her life, her freedom, to save the man who had lied to her. She looked at the journal lying on her table. She thought of her father, living with his guilt, writing about a debt of blood. This wasn't just Owen's fight. It was hers, too. It was her chance to right her father's wrong. She had to get him out. The night of the planned jailbreak was moonless and cold. Pearl dressed in her father's old work pants and a dark shirt, her hair tucked up under a cap. She was just a shadow moving through the silent streets of Whispering Pines. The sheriff's office and jail were at the end of Main Street, a single lamp burning in the front window. Just as Billy had said, the sheriff's snores were audible from the street. The real problem was the deputy, Miller. She crept around to the back. There was a single barred window on the back wall of the jail, Owen's cell. She tapped lightly on the glass. After a moment, his face appeared in the window, a dark shape in the gloom. "Pearl," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "What are you doing?" "Getting you out," she whispered back. "Blackwell's not planning a trial. He's planning a funeral. Yours." She held up the key. "The back door. But the deputy is awake." "Miller," Owen said. "He's a good kid. He's not on Blackwell's payroll." "How can you be sure?" "I've been talking to him. He doesn't like the way Blackwell runs this town any more than we do. But he's scared. He has a family." That was a risk they'd have to take. "I'm going to create a distraction at the front. When you hear it, get Miller to the back door. Tell him he has a choice to make. Pearl, it's too dangerous." "The most dangerous thing I can do right now is nothing," she said, her voice firm. "Be ready." She crept back around to the front of the street. Across from the jailhouse was the livery stable. A stack of hay bales sat near the side wall. It was a terrible idea, a reckless, insane idea. It was perfect. She struck a match, the small flame flickering in the dark. She held it to the dry hay. It didn't explode into flame, but a thick, acrid smoke began to billow out, pouring into the street. She ran, ducking into a dark alleyway. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice high and panicked. "Fire at the livery!" Lights started coming on in the windows up and down the street. A few shouts echoed hers. From inside the sheriff's office, she heard a chair scrape, and the front door burst open. Deputy Miller ran out, saw the smoke, and started yelling for the sheriff and a bucket brigade. That was her chance. She sprinted for the back of the jail. The key slid into the lock, rusty but willing. It turned. The door creaked open. Owen was there, and behind him, Deputy Miller stood with his gun drawn, his young face pale and conflicted. "She's right, son," Owen said to him, his voice calm and steady. "You know what Blackwell is. You know what he's planning for me. You can stand aside and let it happen, or you can do the right thing." Miller's hand was shaking. He looked from Owen to the growing commotion in the street, then back again. He thought of his wife, his baby son. Then he thought of the town, strangled by Blackwell's greed. With a deep breath, he lowered his gun. "Go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell them you overpowered me. Take my horse. It's faster than the sheriff's." "Thank you," Owen said, clapping a hand on the young deputy's shoulder. They didn't have time for more. They slipped out into the darkness, untied the deputy's horse from the rail, and swung up into the saddle, Pearl in front of Owen. They galloped out of town, not toward the main road, but into the wilderness, into the rugged country that made up their own backyard. They were free, and they were fugitives. They rode hard for hours, pushing the horse through the dark, unforgiving terrain. They didn't stop until the first hint of dawn was breaking the eastern sky. They were deep in the rocky canyons on the far edge of the property, a place Pearl knew like the back of her hand. She led them to a small hidden cave tucked behind a waterfall. It was a place her father had shown her when she was a little girl. They were exhausted, cold, and hungry, but they were safe. For now. Inside the cave, Owen finally spoke. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raw. "Why?" "Because they were going to murder you," she said simply. "And because this is my fight too. My father was part of this. I have to see it through." She pulled out the journal, which she'd tucked into her shirt. "My father wrote that the land holds the key. I think he meant this place." They lit a small, smokeless fire. In the flickering light, they examined the cave walls. At first, they saw nothing but rock, but then Pearl noticed it, a series of small, faint carvings on the back wall, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. They were strange symbols, patterns of lines and circles. She opened the journal. On an inside page, tucked away, were the same symbols, sketched in her father's hand. It wasn't just a random doodle. It was a map. "What is it?" Owen asked, leaning closer. The symbols on the wall and in the journal weren't pointing to the spring or to any landmark she recognized. They seemed to indicate a spot even deeper within the cave system. Following the markings, they squeezed through a narrow passage at the back of the main cavern, a passage she had always been too afraid to explore as a child. It opened into another, smaller chamber, and there they found it. Not a treasure chest, not a vein of gold. What they found was a wall of rock that was different from the rest. It was shored up with old, rotting timbers. It was the entrance to a mine, an old, collapsed mine shaft, and on one of the timbers, so faded it was almost gone, was a carving, a pickaxe and a shovel, crossed over the letters C and M, Connolly and McBride. "This is it," Owen breathed, his voice full of awe. "This is their claim." "But the mine collapsed," Pearl said. "It's worthless." "Is it?" Owen ran his hand over the rock face next to the collapsed entrance. He pulled out his knife and scraped at the stone. Beneath a layer of dirt and calcite, something gleamed in the firelight. A thick, unmistakable vein of pure, high-grade silver. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The main silver vein in Whispering Pines hadn't run dry. It had just shifted. Her father and his father had found where it went. This land wasn't just valuable because of the water. It was sitting on a silver lode that would make the original town strike look like pocket change. "This," Owen said, his voice a reverent whisper, "is why Blackwell has been willing to kill. He doesn't just want the water rights. He wants the whole mountain." But a terrible thought was forming in Pearl's mind. She looked at Owen, at the fierce, triumphant light in his eyes. He had told her his story, but had he told her all of it? "Your father," she said slowly. "How did he die? You said he was a broken man, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Owen's triumphant expression faded, replaced by that old, familiar pain. He turned away from the silver and faced her. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "That's not the whole story. After Blackwell stole the claim, my father wouldn't let it go. He threatened to expose him. A few weeks later, he was found at the bottom of a ravine. The sheriff at the time, another one of Blackwell's men, called it a drunken accident. He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze so intense she couldn't look away. But he wasn't a drinker. He was murdered. Blackwell had him killed to silence him, and there was a witness." "Who?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Your father," Owen said, and the words were like stones, heavy and hard. "He was there. He saw the whole thing. But Blackwell had something on him, a secret, something he used to buy your father's silence. Your father stood by and watched my father die, and then he kept his mouth shut about it for 20 years. He took a step closer to her, his face a mask of grief and rage. "So, yes, Pearl, I came here for justice. I came to ruin Blackwell, but I also came for you. I came to take this land, this silver, everything, from the daughter of the man who let my father be murdered." The confession was a blade that sliced right through her. The man she had risked her life for, the man she was starting to feel something for, had come here to destroy her. His entire quest for justice was built on a foundation of revenge against her family. The partnership, the kindness, the protection. It was all a prelude to her ruin. She was a fool. She had broken a liar out of jail, only to find out his lies ran deeper and darker than she could have ever imagined. She was trapped in a cave with him, miles from anyone, with a silver fortune that was now a curse. He wasn't her savior. He was her executioner. His words hung in the darkness of the cave, a poisoned cloud that choked the air from her lungs. He had come to destroy her. All this time, beneath the kindness and the shared fight, that had been his ultimate goal. She backed away from him, her hand falling to the knife still in her pocket. "So what now?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "You have the silver. You have my land. Are you going to finish what you started? Get your final revenge?" Owen looked at her, and the raw anger in his face began to crumble, replaced by a deep, aching conflict. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty in his voice was devastating. "That was the plan. For years, that hate was the only thing that kept me going. But it's not that simple anymore. It hasn't been since the day of the auction." He took a step toward her, his hands open, palms up. "I look at you, and I don't see the daughter of a coward. I see a woman who stood up to Blackwell, who faced down hired guns, who broke me out of jail. I see you." "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't say these things now, not after telling me you came here to ruin me." She pulled the journal out again, her last and only shield. "You're wrong about my father," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He wasn't a coward. He was trapped." She opened it to the last pages, her hands shaking, and read the words her father had scrawled in his final days. "Blackwell knows about the girl, not Pearl, the other one. He holds her life in his hands. He says if I speak, she dies. My silence for her life. It is a devil's bargain, but she is my blood." Owen stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The other one? What other girl?" Pearl's mind was racing, putting together pieces she hadn't understood. "My father. Before he met my mother, he was in love with a woman from the Ute tribe. They couldn't be together, not back then. She had a child, a daughter, my half-sister. He never spoke of her, But he sent money. He made sure she was cared for. Blackwell found out. That was his leverage. That was the secret he held over my father. It wasn't just a threat against me. It was a threat against a child nobody even knew existed. The full, monstrous weight of the truth settled over them. Her father hadn't been a coward who stood by and watched a murder. He had been a father, protecting his children in the only way he could, by accepting a lifetime of silent guilt. The loan from Blackwell, the one for her mother's medicine, had never existed. It was blackmail money. He was paying Blackwell for his silence, year after year. "He didn't betray your father," Pearl said, tears streaming down her face. "He was enslaved by the same man." Owen looked as if he'd been struck. The hatred that had fueled him for so long was built on a lie. His quest for vengeance was a ghost. He sank down onto a rock, burying his face in his hands. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had done, was wrong. They were not enemies. Their families hadn't been on opposite sides. They were victims of the same man, their lives and histories twisted into knots of pain by the greed of Otto Blackwell. A sound from the cave entrance made them both freeze. A scraping of boots on rock. They weren't alone. A man stepped out of the shadows of the narrow passage. He was tall and thin, with a cruel, narrow face and eyes like chips of ice. He held a Winchester rifle, and it was aimed directly at them. He wasn't one of Blackwell's usual thugs. This man was a professional. "Owen McBride," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. "Big bounty on your head, and it looks like I get a bonus." His cold eyes flickered to Pearl. "Blackwell wants you both, dead or alive. Doesn't matter much to me which." It was a bounty hunter. Blackwell hadn't just relied on the law. He'd put a price on their heads. Before Pearl could even scream, Owen moved. He shoved her behind him, grabbing a loose rock from the floor and hurling it at the bounty hunter. It was a desperate move, but it worked. The man flinched, his rifle shot going wide, the bullet ricocheting off the cave walls with a deafening crack. In that split second, Owen charged. He slammed into the bounty hunter, and the two men crashed to the ground, grappling for the rifle. The cave was filled with the sounds of their struggle, grunts of effort and pain echoing in the tight space. Pearl, her mind screaming, looked around for a weapon, her father's knife. It was still in her pocket. She pulled it out and scrambled toward the fighting men. The bounty hunter was stronger. He had Owen pinned, his hands reaching for Owen's throat. Without thinking, Pearl lunged, driving the knife into the fleshy part of the bounty hunter's shoulder. He roared in pain, his grip on Owen loosening. Owen twisted, landing a solid punch on the man's jaw. The bounty hunter's head snapped back, and he went limp. Silence. Heavy, ragged breathing. Owen got to his feet, pulling Pearl up with him. "You all right?" he panted. She nodded, her whole body trembling. They stood over the unconscious man. "We have to get out of here," Owen said. "If he found us, others will too." They tied the bounty hunter securely with his own rope. As Owen was checking the man's pockets for ammunition, he found something else. A folded piece of paper. It was a letter. He read it in the dim firelight, his face hardening. "This is from Blackwell," he said. "Instructions. He tells the bounty hunter that if he finds us, he's to dispose of the bodies in this old mine shaft. He says the mine is unstable and that a small controlled explosion would seal it forever, hiding any evidence. Blackwell wasn't just going to kill them, he was going to erase them." But then Owen's eyes narrowed. "Pearl, listen to this. Blackwell writes, 'Once the McBride business is settled, I can finally proceed with my partners from the territorial capital. The deed from the bank auction, combined with the geological surveys hidden in my office ledger, will give us all the proof we need to secure the federal land grant.'" "His office ledger," Pearl breathed. They looked at each other, the same audacious, impossible idea dawning on them both. The proof of everything, the stolen claim, the geological surveys, maybe even evidence of his other crimes, was sitting in his office. "We can't run forever," Owen said, his voice low and intense. "Running is what our fathers did. It's time to stop running. It's time to end this." "He'll have the whole town looking for us," Pearl said. "The bank will be guarded." "They'll be looking for us in the mountains," Owen countered. "The last place they'll expect us to be is right under their noses, back in Whispering Pines." It was suicide, a desperate, foolhardy plan. But it was also their only chance, not just to save themselves, but to get justice for their fathers, to uncover the truth that had been buried for 20 years. "All right," Pearl said, her voice steady now, the fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Let's go to the bank." Sneaking back into Whispering Pines was like entering a wolf's den. They moved under the cover of darkness, using alleys and backways Pearl had known since childhood. The town was on high alert. Armed men, Blackwell's men, patrolled the streets. A massive posse was being organized to hunt them in the mountains at first light. The bank was a dark fortress on Main Street. A single guard was posted at the front door. "How do we get in?" Pearl whispered, as they hid in the shadows across the street. "Deputy Miller," Owen said. "If he truly wants to help, now is his chance." Leaving Pearl in hiding, Owen slipped away. It was the longest 30 minutes of her life. Every footstep, every distant shout, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was sure he'd been caught. But then he reappeared, and with him was Deputy Miller, his young face a mask of terror and determination. "The guard at the front is one of Blackwell's," Miller whispered. "But the back door to the office has a simple lock. I can get you in. You'll have 10 minutes, maybe less, before the night watchman does his rounds." It was now or never. Miller led them down a dark alley behind the bank. The lock clicked softly under his key. "The ledger is usually in the bottom drawer of his desk," he said. "Good luck." He melted back into the shadows, a young man risking everything for what was right. The inside of Blackwell's office was suffocatingly opulent. The air smelled of cigar smoke and money. Owen stood guard at the door, while Pearl went straight to the massive oak desk. The bottom drawer was locked. "Of course it is," she muttered, frustration welling up. She pulled her father's knife from her belt and jammed it into the lock, twisting and prying with all her might. The wood splintered, the lock groaned, and then, with a sharp crack, it gave way. Inside was a large, leather-bound ledger. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. It was all there. Coded transactions, payments to shell companies, notes on the geological surveys of her land. It was the blueprint of Blackwell's entire criminal enterprise. And then she found it. Tucked into the back of the book was a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter, written 20 years ago. It was from Blackwell to the sheriff at the time. It was a direct order. "McBride is becoming a problem. He needs to have an accident. Make it look convincing. Your bonus will be substantial." It was the proof, the smoking gun that would not only free them, but would finally bring justice for Angus McBride. "I've got it," she whispered, a sob of relief catching in her throat. But as she closed the ledger, a floorboard creaked in the main bank lobby. Owen stiffened, holding up a hand for silence. Someone was coming. It was the night watchman, making his rounds early. They were trapped. The front door was impossible. The back door would take too long to unlock from this side. There was only one other exit, the large window behind Blackwell's desk. It looked out onto the side alley. "Go," Owen hissed, shoving the ledger into her hands. "Get out the window. I'll hold him off." "No, I'm not leaving you." "There's no time to argue. Get the proof to Miller. It's the only way this works. Go." He pushed her toward the window as the office door handle began to turn. Pearl fumbled with the latch on the heavy window, her heart hammering against her ribs. It swung open with a low groan. She threw the ledger out into the alley and scrambled to follow. Behind her, she heard the office door burst open. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" She looked back one last time. Owen wasn't reaching for a gun. He had kicked over Blackwell's heavy leather chair, blocking the doorway. He gave her a desperate, determined look. "Run, Pearl." Then he turned to face the guard, and the last thing she saw was him charging, not to fight, but to buy her time. She hit the ground in the alley, scooped up the ledger, and ran as if the devil himself were at her heels. She found Miller in the appointed spot, behind the church. She thrust the ledger into his hands, gasping for breath. "Owen, he's still in there. They have him." Miller's face was grim. "Then we have to make sure he didn't sacrifice himself for nothing." They didn't go to the sheriff. They went to the church. The sun was just beginning to rise, and soon the good people of Whispering Pines would be arriving for Sunday service. Working frantically, they took the ledger apart, page by page. They nailed them to the heavy oak doors of the church, the coded transactions, the land surveys, and right in the center, the letter ordering the murder of Angus McBride. By the time the first churchgoers arrived, the story of Otto Blackwell's crimes was plastered for all to see. The town square became a scene of chaos. People crowded around the church doors, reading the evidence of Blackwell's treachery in stunned silence, a silence that slowly grew into a murmur, and then into a roar of outrage. Families who had been cheated, miners who had been squeezed, ranchers who had been bullied, they all saw their own stories reflected in those ledger pages. Blackwell, hearing the commotion from his home, came to see what was happening. When he saw the crowd and the pages nailed to the church door, his face went white with fury. He was exposed, ruined. But a cornered rat is the most dangerous animal of all. He didn't run. He drew a pistol from his coat, his eyes wild. He grabbed the nearest person, the timid auctioneer who had sold Pearl's cabin, and held the gun to his head. "Get back!" he screamed at the crowd. "All of you, get back!" The crowd recoiled in terror. Blackwell started backing toward the bank, dragging the terrified auctioneer with him. "I want a horse and safe passage, and I want the deed to the Connolly land, now!" Inside the bank, Owen had been subdued and was being held in the vault. Hearing the shouts, his guards ran out to see what was happening, leaving him alone. He could hear Blackwell's crazed demands through the thick steel door. Suddenly, the vault door swung open. It was Deputy Miller, his gun drawn. "It's over, McBride," he said. But he wasn't looking at Owen. He was looking past him, at the back wall of the vault. Blackwell had a tunnel dug from his house to the vault years ago. An escape route. He's probably heading for it now. "Then we have to stop him," Owen said. They raced through the dusty, narrow tunnel. It emerged, as Miller had guessed, in the cellar of Blackwell's house. They could hear him upstairs, ransacking the place, grabbing money and gold. They stormed up the stairs. Blackwell spun around, his gun raised, but Owen was faster. He tackled the banker, sending them both crashing over a table. The gun skittered across the floor. Miller scooped it up. It was over. Otto Blackwell, the king of Whispering Pines, was finally brought down, not by a gunslinger's bullet, but by the truth. Pearl stood on the porch of her father's cabin, which was now, finally and truly, her cabin. It had been 3 months since that chaotic Sunday. Blackwell was in a federal prison, awaiting trial for a list of crimes so long it would take years to sort through. Owen had been cleared of all charges, his name and his father's name finally vindicated. The silver they had found in the mine was theirs. It was a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. But they weren't using it to build a mansion. They were using it to heal a town. They established a new bank, one that offered fair loans. They helped families who had been ruined by Blackwell buy back their land. Whispering Pines was being reborn. Owen came and stood beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. The ranch was thriving. The future, which had once seemed like a dark, endless tunnel, was now as bright and open as the Colorado sky. "Happy?" he asked, his voice soft. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible," she said. "It all started with a lie." "And ended with the truth," he finished. He turned her to face him, his stormy eyes soft now. "Pearl Connolly, I came to this town looking for revenge. But I found redemption instead. I found you." "I think," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that maybe our fathers knew what they were doing all along. They left us a map, not just to a silver mine, but to each other." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that held all the promise of a new beginning, built on the foundations of a painful past. The sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and silver, a treasure far more precious than anything they could ever dig from the ground. If you were moved by Pearl and Owen's fight for justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that will leave you breathless.